Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Makdis History podcast. We're very happy today to have with us to talk about Syria, what's going on in Syria today, and kind of to properly contextualize it and provide some of the political economy as well, the war economy, and other aspects of what's going on in Syria today. To have Professor Omar Dahi with us. He's a professor of economics at Hampshire College in the United States. He's also the founding director of the project, which is called Security in Context, which is a research network on peace, conflict, and international affairs. And I encourage everybody to look that up online. There's a lot of publications and a lot of interesting policy papers that deals globally and in the global south, but also, of course, in the Middle East and Syria as well. He's very widely published in both academic and policy outlets, and he combines this. He's written a number of books and articles that deal with, the last one is South-South Trade and Finance in the 21st Century, the Rise of the South, or a Second Great Divergence, and that was co-authored. He's also the founding member of the Beirut School of Critical Security Studies within the Arab Council for the Social Sciences, that's the ACSS. Ahmad has been a lead expert at the UN Economic and Social Commission for West Asia in the National Agenda for the Future Syria program. So he's been involved over the past decade and more in dealing with the fallout in the Syrian revolution, the Syrian revolt, and the consequences over the past decade. So we can't find a better person to talk about Syria today. So Omar, welcome. So Omar, welcome to the Makdis History podcast. We're really thrilled to have you here to talk, as I had said in the introduction, about what's going on, to try to make sense actually what's going on in Syria today. Especially since you approach it both as an academic and political economist, and at the same time, of course, you're Syrian and you have a kind of very kind of personal connection. So to be able to kind of weave the personal with the more analytical kind of scholarly attention to this would be great. So we'd like to start by just asking you about your own story. Growing up in Syria, and then how you made your way to the United States, how you became politicized in that sense in Syria, and then what it meant when the Syrian revolution or uprising began, 2011, 2012, and maybe then bring it to where we are today, sort of maybe even comparing the feelings you had then, witnessing that kind of revolt, that kind of uprising in the early phase, and then now its kind of conclusion, and how you felt, what the concerns are, anything that you feel like is interesting to bring up. That would be great for us to hear from you.
Well, first of all, hi, Karim, Sari, and Usama. Thank you so much for having me. I've been a big follower of the Makdis History podcast, and it's really an honor to be among you and chat about this. Karim and I have had many conversations over the years, and a lot of my thoughts on Syria actually been formed with this back and forth with Karim and helping each other figure things out. So it's good to be here also to figure out stuff with you guys. Very briefly, my background, was born and raised in Damascus, Syria. I grew up in an Arab nationalist household that was Nasserist and anti-Ba'athist. So a kind of a Nasserist Arab nationalist household. And that really formed my worldview. And during my youth, it shaped my outlook on the world, both in terms of kind of Syria's role, but also the region and internationally. And in many ways continues to influence my thinking until today, even though I've kind of evolved in various other ways and been influenced by different currents. But I still think that, the basic framework of thinking about the Arabs as a nation with common bonds, of thinking about the role of Western imperialism, of thinking about the role of Israel in the region as it used to be called in the 60s, the spearhead of imperialism, still is valid and in terms of actually not just the big picture, but also understanding lots of changes taking place today. I came to the U.S. To go to college. I've been here ever since. Up until 2011, I used to travel back and forth quite frequently to Syria, and the last time I was in Syria, however, was in August and early July of 2011 when I went down to visit and travel throughout the country. At that time, if you all remember, the uprising was transforming from largely nonviolent, even though not exclusively, because there was violent from the beginning. I'm not talking about the government side, which always had violence in it, but in terms of oppositionally, was largely nonviolent. But in June and July and August, those summer months, there was increasing kind of at least public declarations of armed uh, resistance, conflict, attacks among the opposition. Um, and since then, I haven't been able to go back for a variety of reasons, but I've been involved with not just academic analysis, but also policy work on Syria, mainly through the United Nations Economic and Social Commission of West Asia, working with them on a major project that was at that time called the National Agenda for the Future of Syria. And that saw me travel to Beirut about 4 or 5 times a year from kind of 2013, 14 till 2019. And so that's been kind of my connection to kind of the work about Syria. The conditions now and in 2011 are very different. So, I mean, kind of your question is about, how am I reacting to things now versus 2011? And obviously, there's 13 years, I was 13 years younger. And at that time, I remember that 2010, 2011 was a much more hopeful moment because regionally there were the uprisings, which I think for many of us were at least a moment that we thought would bring about a positive transformation and progressive democratic change throughout the region. My first kid was born. My daughter was born 2010, late 2010, early 2011. I'm like, this is great. Things are looking up in the world. My son was born January 2013. So by that time, things have significantly deteriorated, and we'd become much more cynical and skeptical because of counter-revolutionary forces, because of the kind of Western and other regional intervention into Syria that had transformed the conflict radically, not just from a civil war, but to a proxy war, to kind of a very complicated mess, which we could talk more about and sort through. So my experience now is colored by and shaped by the kind of experiences that we've all lived through over the past 13 years that have made us much more skeptical. It's also shaped by the immense challenges that Syria has, even before getting to the geopolitics, the kind of developmental destruction, the displacement, the all sorts of fault lines of conflict that have been created over the years. And of course, shaped by the genocide that's happening in Palestine, which, along with the Israeli invasion and the destruction of the Syrian army, as well as a host of other things, the current moment is very fraught and troubling. So there's all these kind of things that make my response different than 2011. At the same time, there is a moment in which not the entirety of the conflict, not even the last year, but since November 27th, the way the regime actually collapsed in the manner that it did, which also took place after several years of relatively frozen front lines. The lack of severe bloodshed on those last 2 weeks created possibilities for, despite all these difficulties, a kind of a progressive way forward, or at least a somewhat positive way forward. Obviously, things are moving at a fast pace. But that we can kind of take all of that in alongside what I think is really incredible joy for many, many Syrians who to them are, facing for the first time, not being under the boot of the Assad government, Assad regime, the all sorts of scenes that we've seen in terms of people, kind of opening the prisons of, especially Sednaya prison and so on. So a mixture of contradictory feelings, but one that's very, tries to take all those things together.
Thanks, Omar. So, I think we're going to come back to quite a few of the threads that you just mentioned. In particular, I think we're all trying to wrestle with this notion, trying to think through the idea of saying, of course, this kind of liberation, as many will see it, this revolution, the idea of toppling a dictator, as many will see it, but at the same time being concerned about the various kind of proxy war implications to it, the larger geopolitics, and trying to sort out these two things and see if one is able to reconcile these two things in in a kind of coherent analysis. So in your mind, what exactly is going on now? Is this a revolution that comes to the fore, and now there'll be a kind of slow peace building process, a kind of state building process that's going to take place with reform? The idea that Jolani seems to have, swapped his long beard for a trimmed beard and a kind of a suit, and sounds more moderate, sounds and even more liberal in some cases. How do you see this transformation from a kind of a religious, let's say, more qaida style of revolt, as far as they're concerned, to something that's more nation building, something that's trying to kind of bring the different groups together and trying to create a Syria across the different sects, the different religions, the different provinces and areas, to kind of create one Syria? How do you see this?
Well, there's a lot there in that question alone in terms of how do we describe the moment, how do we understand how we got here, and what do we think about the current moment? And I could go back a little bit and talk about how we got here a little bit, because I think that's important to think about. And I'm not going to try to rehash the entire history of the Syrian civil war, but I think kind of the general brush strokes, if you don't mind, because I think that's key to providing that context. Otherwise, it's kind of, I'm going to have to always go back to it because so and so happened. So by 2012, January 2012, Al-Nusra Front, which is a group of Al-Qaeda fighters that had come from Iraq, that had been in Iraq, came and established themselves in Syria and declared itself as an entity, alongside what was called the Free Syrian Army. Those are, at that time, were two of the main groups fighting the Syrian regime. And you had, for a period of time between 2012 and 2013-14, this proliferation of militias, this radical kind of increase in funding and arming and kind of empowering of lots of militias through Turkey, through the Gulf countries.
Omar, sorry, Omar, I hate to interrupt, but just quickly, just to rewind a little bit, just before 2012. I mean, how long? A lot of people, talk about the revolution in Syria in 2011. And then it seems to have morphed into something else. How long was it sort of an uprising like the one in Egypt or Tunisia or other places in the so-called Arab Spring? How long did it last, that sort of popular insurgent phrase, until what you just described? Like, what was the timeline like just for that period too?
So that's a matter of debate, actually. I mean, this is not something that is settled among kind of scholars of the Syrian civil war, let's say, so to speak, or the Syrian revolution. I would say that there were significant protests that were nonviolent, which kind of leads me to kind of think about the moment as a revolutionary moment throughout the country. So I'll give you my example of Hama. I visited Hama in August 2011 and had been taken over by the local population. So I kind of spent a couple of days there, that, lots of people manning checkpoints, lots of people organizing daily life, and so on and so forth. So there was that moment. We know now, and we've kind of known for some while, that even from the very early months of March, April, May, there were violence committed by people opposed to the regime, by attacking regime soldiers, by assassinations, and so on. But the leadership of the uprising, the leadership of the opposition, the kind of elites were still raising the banners of the revolution that were three slogans: no to violence, no to sectarianism, no to foreign intervention. So at least at the level of discourse, at the level of capturing the center of gravity of the moment, it was largely nonviolent, and the leaders were not embracing violence and not embracing external intervention. By the end of that, from March 2011 to March 2012, that had significantly changed. The significant sections of the Syrian opposition still embraced those slogans, but they were considered somehow not true opposition. They were kind of considered pro-regime by that point. And so they were excluded. So the leadership of the opposition over, particularly the months from June onwards, had changed. They had come to not embrace sectarianism, but they condoned it and didn't outright criticize it sufficiently. they did not criticize the increasing armed opposition, and then came to see it as the only path against the government. That was mostly due to, I mean, that was, I shouldn't say mostly, but a significant part of that had to do with the refusal of the government to initiate any process of political change. But it was also induced by what they hoped would be the Libyan model to be replicated, and essentially would invite an armed intervention. And I think there was, at the very least, among some of them, a cynical attempt to, force the hand of the international community by invading, and all sorts of other funding from the Gulf, from kind of Turkish groups being kind of empowered, and other groups, Turkish supported groups being empowered. So that happened over the first year. It's hard for me to put a kind of exact timetable on that. But that evolution, I would say, happened within the first 6 months of the uprising.
So, Omar, thank you for that. So, question: how do you separate, therefore, a discussion of the Syrian revolution or civil war, as you described it, or both? You're describing it as both happening from 2011 onwards. How do you separate that from the wider geopolitics? Because it seems to me there's often a clash, or there's tension when we come to discussing Syria. When people talk about geopolitics, people say you shouldn't do that. And when people talk about a wider context, in other words, outside of Syria, what's happening in Lebanon, what's happening in Palestine, as you mentioned. I'm looking behind you at the wall behind you. You have two Mandate, I think, era pictures or posters, one of Palestine, one of Syria. This was an interconnected geography, history, culture, etc. So how do you separate talking, just for lay people, talking about Syria separate from the rest of the region on the one hand, to give Syria the weight it deserves and the centrality it deserves at one level? On the other hand, how do you not talk about geopolitics? Can you help us think through I know these are big points, but it is important, because can you talk about Syria without Lebanon and Palestine and the region?
That's a really good question. I think I just published an article in Middle East Law and Governance Journal alongside some colleagues, kind of a special issue on war economies in the region. And there was an article about Jordan and one about Yemen that tries to question this binary, which we always hear about, that there's geopolitics up here and on the ground down here, and they're separate spheres. And that's not how I understand the world. I think it's interconnected. I think they shape each other. So it's not simply geopolitics determines everything. It's not simply that there's an unfettered kind of on the ground forces that are affected by it, but I think they shape each other. And I think with Syria, it's obvious. And I think there are various ways that we can materially point to this, when that doesn't mean that the world is a chessboard, right? And geopolitics determine everything. But I think if you look at the history of that first year, for example, there were significant civic and local initiatives that became known as the local coordination councils. My personal way of tracing this is when the local coordination councils as a whole decided to join the e'tilaf, which was centered in Istanbul. That was a link between the on-ground and geopolitics, because the local coordination councils that were very much local and civic, and people trying, whatever their critiques, there were people trying to manage their affairs in the best as possible, given whatever level of politicization they have, whatever level of experience they had, then subsume themselves under the leadership of a foreign-backed and controlled entity that was headquartered in Turkey, which itself had strategic and national interests in Syria. And also that Itilaf was funded by Saudi, Emirates, Qatar, and so on. So that basically, it's, to me personally, and this is not a point that's widely made, this is my perspective, that shows you that you cannot separate it, because a lot of their actions came interpreted through, many of them actually even today go back and say, well, at that time we were told this is what's best for the revolution, and so on. So they basically subsumed themselves under an elite. A lot of it was the Muslim Brotherhood. A lot of them had been exiled, to the Gulf. And so that then, inserted these Syrian kind of activists into the geopolitics of not just, U.S. Western kind of allied against Syria, but the fault lines between those factions themselves. So you had the emerging Turkey and Qatar axis, which we'll come back to because it's relevant today, on the one hand, and the UAE, Saudi Arabian axis on the other hand. And even between the UAE and Saudi Arabia, there's slight tension. So all of that fragmentation, or all of those interests came to kind of fragment the opposition and kind of subvert its kind of outlook. But I think more broadly, I think it doesn't make sense to think of them as disconnected. But I think it also doesn't. It's not simply an answer to say, well, there's geopolitics and they're not disconnected, because there's also the fact that there is a regime that created a certain type of rule that I think to say was influenced by geopolitics itself. I mean, the Syrian government and Syrian regime was shaped by a certain type of politics which prevailed in the region, and the interplay between kind of anti-imperialist resistance and the militarization of the region also shaped the way these regimes developed. But I think in 2011, it was clear that whatever that regime had was no longer sustainable, and it needed to initiate a process of change. And the kind of national opposition forces were specifically making the point you're making. We are in basically a region and in a kind of international order where this could be out of control. So either the regime leads the process of change, now that there's a mass movement demanding it, or we're going to go into the unknown. We're going to go to a disaster. And that was what most of people were saying. You need to lead this process of change and have meaningful change.
So I'm just to be clear, you're talking about 2011? Is this what we're 2011? So at the beginning of the revolution, or
at the beginning of the revolution, and I think they didn't. And what's worse is that you could say in 2011, okay, Bashar al-Assad had a chance. He came to power in 2000, and then 2011 was 11 years later. So you had the chance for 11 years. You could even say that in 2011 they were caught off guard, even though that's not an excuse. But in the last 6-7 years, there was the freezing of the front lines. So in 2017, 2018, 2019, there was no real threat to the government. And it accepted the de facto fragmentation of the country. It accepted the significant penetration, and this is going back to your question, of international forces. I mean, so the loss of sovereignty that Syria has witnessed has been happening over the past decade. It's not something, the latest actions that you see by Israel and other forces are the kind of outcome of this loss of sovereignty, the process that started several years ago, both in terms of the presence of international troops, U.S. presence, Turkish presence, Iranian and Russian kind of military support and presence in Syria, but also economically. I mean, there was a kind of division of economic kind of spoils of the war, where kind of the U.S. was, along with Kurdish political forces, controlling the oil fields. Russia was awarded natural gas, phosphate, and fertilizer contracts. Some of our colleagues in Syrian research centers even found very plausibly that Russia was controlling Syrian natural gas and selling it back to the government at market prices, basically. Even the arrangement with the Kurdish political forces was under more favorable conditions in terms of the oil that they were transferring, but less favorable towards Russia. So you had this significant loss of sovereignty that ended and that became complete with the collapse of the Syrian regime in the way that it did. So for all those reasons, I think we need to kind of be very careful. No single term. You talked about liberation. Can liberation really capture this? I think analytically, no single term can capture what's happening, either kind of over the past 10 years or what's today. Even the collapse of the Syrian regime, I mean, it did collapse, but I think there are ways in which it might reemerge in various ways, and that's kind of something that we need to kind of think about. The fact that the army disbanded and many of them went home, but is this going to stay forever? What's going to happen in terms of the other fault lines of the war? We can get into that a little bit more if you wish in terms of the current moment, but I think it's hard to capture everything that happened. But there's also the politics of how people kind of are engaging with this, the politics of how civil society and different groups kind of think about the current moment. And I think I have to respect that, and we have to respect that as well.
Omar, before we get to kind of to focus on what's going on today, I just, since a lot of your own work and your own sort of scholarship, but also your policy work, kind of centers around war economies, and I know you've done a lot of work also on the sanctions. So can you give us an idea of in this period from over the past several years? I don't know when to date it, but maybe 2014, 2015 onwards. Maybe that's a separate period when the Russians come in and I don't know if it's stabilized, but there's a kind of a status quo that ends up happening. What is the economy? What is the political economy like in Syria? And we hear a lot about the Captagon. Is it simply the case that Bashar al-Assad's assets were simply all won by the Captagon? That's it. That's all there was. And meanwhile, there was just microeconomies working at very local level, at black markets. How did Syria how did the war economy work in Syria? Can you just give us? I know it's a very big question, but in summary, in brief, how did people survive, basically, and how did the regime survive in this period?
Well, so it evolved. I mean, the answer to that question is it depends what time period we're talking about in the last kind of 13 years. But I'll try to give the general sense, which is that the Syrian economy had a certain path dependence of kind of an institutionalization of the state socialist model, of which, especially under the later years of Hafiz al-Assad, early and later years of Hafiz al-Assad, kind of put a premium on agricultural and other forms of self-sufficiency. So the Syrian economy had a certain resilience because it was diverse. It had some manufacturing, it had some agriculture, it had some tourism, it had service sector. It wasn't something that was only focused on one form of kind of production. Of course, oil was the major form of revenue. Syria's oil was never significant at the international sense, but in terms of Syria's own budget, it was very significant. So Syria's oil production at its peak was around 400,000 barrels per day. That was significantly diminished as a result of the sanctions. So one major factor of understanding the Syrian economy was the sanctions, which essentially hit not just U.S. sanctions, but particularly the European Union sanctions. The European Union was Syria's biggest trading partner. So the sanctions that the European Union imposed on Syria basically prevented Syria from reaching its major markets in terms of some of its non-oil exports, but preliminary its oil exports. So if you think about the way the economy was shaped, I would say there's the destruction, the three main factors of the destruction from the conflict, the destruction of physical infrastructure, the destruction of commercial and the looting of commercial infrastructure that happened, the fragmentation that resulted from the war. Syria has, like I said, a diverse economy, but its resources are not equally distributed, right? So it has kind of breadbaskets in the northeast and in parts of the western parts and in southern and central plains. Most of the oil is in the northeast as well. So the territorial fragmentation of the country also played a role in kind of exacerbating the economic crisis. And then you had mismanagement as a result of all parties prioritizing military conflict and kind of transferring resources into the armed conflict, particularly the Syrian government and the other kind of factions as well, and outsourcing in the opposition areas of economic provisions to international humanitarian agencies, to local non-governmental initiatives, which performed unevenly and not very, very well. But I think in terms of, back to your question to the sanctions, I think that's significant. And I think it's decisive in many ways, because there's an interesting way in which we can think of this in light of what's happening in Israel. The European Union, within the first few months, had imposed the entire range of sanctions against the Syrian government. And there were several studies at that time that showed it was unprecedented in terms of going from no sanctions to the entire 100%, 0 to 100%, whatever, all the kind of instruments that they have with their, versus the continued support for Israel, let alone sanctions. So that points to the geopolitical economic warfare aspect of using sanctions as a tool against kind of the enemies of the West. basically.
Sorry to interrupt. I'm gonna just, can you clarify, are the sanctions UN sanctions or are the unilateral EU/US sanctions? Just for the readers and I mean, for the viewers and listeners, can you just elaborate if these are like the Iraq sanctions, in other words, or these are something else?
There are two types of sanctions. There's the unilateral sanctions. They were mostly European and the US and Arab countries imposed unilateral sanctions on Syria. There were United Nations sanctions as well, but the United Nations sanctions are actually, ironically, mostly now on the group that is in power, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Because to get those UN sanctions, you would need kind of agreement between Russia and China and the allies of the Syrian government, which would veto sanctions that were blanket sanctions imposed by the United Nations. So actually lifting the sanctions, the blanket sanctions right now, in terms of the US and the EU, those are unilateral sanctions that can be lifted, right? But the other sanctions that need to be lifted are the United Nations sanctions that designate Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and other similar, armed groups as terrorist organizations. That was the kind of compromise under the various UN resolutions, including Resolution 2254, which basically saw the idea that all the different governments, including allies of the Syrian government and its opponents, supposedly had an interest in fighting terrorism, so they could agree on listing those groups as terrorist organizations. But there was disagreement on, vis-a-vis the Syrian government itself. So there's both kinds of sanctions, and I think both of them have certain complications. And this is the way in which I think various regional and Western powers are going to continue to influence the transition. And one of the kind of warning signs I think that we can see is that, once the U.S. imposes sanctions, it's very hard to lift them. U.S. has imposed some sort of sanctions on Syria almost my entire lifetime. I was born in 1978. I think the first U.S. sanctions on Syria in 1979, and it's continued until today. It's gotten, of course, progressively deeper and deeper, and we can kind of think about how it's going to be used and where the fault lines are. But both of those kind of sanctions exist.
Ahmad, just quickly on the question of oil. You mentioned the importance of oil locally to the Syrian economy. And I assume you mean partly because of the export, even if it's limited, it's still revenue of some kind, but presumably also for internal consumption as well, or not. I would assume so, but you can clarify that. But in the meantime, the oil-producing regions of Syria, I gather, are in the east or the northeast. So presumably they have not been under government control since, 2012 or something like that, right? So what's happening to the oil? I know the U.S. has parked its army on the oil, or oil-developing regions, oil-producing regions. But where's the oil going? Who benefits from it? And literally, is it being trucked, or is it being piped? Is it being pumped? What's up with the oil, basically?
So in general, the oil production significantly declined. It's under the control of the Syrian Democratic Forces, Quwat Surya Demokratiya, Qasad, which are primarily Kurdish political groups, not exclusively Kurdish, but primarily Kurdish, and kind of guarded and kind of whose control is enforced by the US. The production is in the tens of thousands of barrels per day, nowhere near the large kind of production. There was a lot of destruction as a result of the war, as a result of the bombing by the US against ISIS, which left horrendous destruction in Deir ez-Zor and other places. So there's a lot of damage to the oil production facilities that happened. But the resumption, part of that, and then Syria, and then there's U.S. companies essentially that also manage this and have been awarded contracts to manage part of the extraction. It's not clear to the full extent of where it's going. We don't know fully, and I don't know fully where it's going, but it's being exported in various ways. Some of it was exported back to Turkey. In the war economy, all sorts of different parties traded with each other, even across the front lines. So, there was obviously political fragmentation, but across the lines of kind of combat, there was trading of oil products there were agreements between the Syrian Democratic Forces and the government forces to supply oil at, I would say, reasonably cheap prices. Of course, the Syrian regime was also being supplied by oil by Iran as well. So the vast majority was kind of coming as a combination of both, rather than just the oil within Syria. There was also agreements between the SDF and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham areas in Idlib also to supply oil. So there were various ways in which they all traded with each other. And then there is Syrian natural gas, which was, like I said, under the control of Russian forces. But it still now, presumably, would be kind of passed on to the control of the new Syrian government, which could revive that, electric generation capacity, which is needed at this point to kind of resume kind of the economic revival in the country, if that's to be the case.
Omar, just to follow up, because I think we interrupted you earlier. I'm still curious. In this period, how did normal, ordinary people live within this larger kind of war economy? So, you've talked about the oil, and Syria being divided. You have the kind of the Turkish influence. You have the Americans. You have with the regime influence. Presumably, again, we keep hearing about the Captagon. That the vast majority, as I understand it, of the revenue that came to Bashar al-Assad and his kind of surroundings was via the Captagon, among other things. At least that's a significant. Then how did ordinary people survive? Was it simply bartering and informal market? But in how so? How did they cut through the lines?
Well, the rise of the drug trade, in my opinion, was an outcome of the war. Captagon was not a production that was in any major way happening in Syria prior to 2010, 2011. And my analysis is that as a result of the sanctions, as a result of the hollowing out of the economy, that became a potential lucrative business for many Syrians and for revenue for the government, basically. And I think there's no doubt that many parts of kind of the previous Syrian regime were involved in the drug trade and formed basic revenue for them. But that was a result of the degradation as a result of the war. It's an outcome of the war, basically. There are estimates that maybe a quarter of Syrians. This estimates by Syrian Center for Policy Research. I don't forget the exact figure, but somewhere between kind of 15 to 25% of Syrians were involved in the war economy of some kind. Most of the people employed, I think, today in government-controlled areas are public sector employees. So basically, they're getting salaries from the government. The value of their salaries has significantly deteriorated. But I think that's something that we need to also think about today, especially if there's this kind of mass liberalization and kind of reducing government expenditure. It's going to put people deeper into poverty. But there was money coming into the country through kind of almost $50 billion was spent in terms of humanitarian aid over the past decades, or more than that. But that's kind of some of the estimates. So there was the drop in the national economy. There was kind of public sector spending in government-held areas and international humanitarian spending in areas outside of government control. There was kind of a extraction of resources from by many of the de facto powers in those different areas to kind of extract agriculture and sell it. So there are various ways in which people survived, but the fact that now the poverty rates are at unprecedented rates tells you that essentially that they were not surviving very well. So there was a precipitous decline in the level of human development, and kind of basic indicators, life expectancy declined, all sorts of health indicators declined. The majority of Syrian people are under very high levels of poverty, and so that's indication that people were not doing well, obviously, but also that all the mechanisms for economic kind of the economic cycle were being dismantled one by one.
So Omar, based on this question of so we've mentioned the Americans and oil, we've mentioned Captagon, you're talking about the deterioration of life and the sanctions, U.S. and EU imposed sanctions on Syria during the last decade. What was the role of Iran and Russia in the political economy analysis of this decade leading up to where we are today? In other words, what was Iran doing in Syria in terms of affecting the political economy, or was it simply the presence there was what triggered sanctions? Can you clarify a little bit more for
No,
our listeners and viewers?
Iran's presence was not what triggered sanctions. I mean, basically, Iran and Russia uh, saw that over the past years in the lead up to the uprising, we know that there is a kind of uh, regional Cold War that was happening, in which many of the Gulf countries wanted to kind of contain Iran and essentially push back what they saw as kind of Iran's role in various capitals in the region. And they saw an opportunity in the Syrian war to do that. And I think this was a big part of the funding, is to kind of draw in Iran and Hezbollah in particular into a kind of a war of attrition that would essentially exhaust them in Syria, and kind of, rather than confronting them directly, they would confront them in Syria. The success of the oppositional forces led to many credible feelings and in fact, kind of evidence that the Syrian regime might actually collapse at the hands of the opposition forces. That triggered further Iranian and Russian involvement, basically. And there was a point where I think even the United States, in tacit agreement with Russia, did not want a precipitous collapse of the Syrian regime, and therefore kind of, even though they condemned the Russian kind of intervention that attacked the opposition forces, it was with some sort of U.S.-Russian agreement on the need to essentially eliminate the various threats that had developed at that time against the Syrian government. Of course, this is after the U.S. had successfully enabled and empowered significant degradation of the Syrian government's capacity. So, I mean, both of those things were true at the same time. But I think having saved the Syrian regime, Iran and Russia also took advantage of the disproportionate leverage they have against it to create very favorable economic conditions for themselves. So, for example, in 2019, there were more than 10 memorandums of kind of agreement that was signed by Iran and Syria in housing, construction, manufacturing, all sorts of industrial production. And Russia, similarly, as I mentioned, in terms of natural gas, phosphates, and fertilizers. I don't think the primary goal of those countries were there to enrich themselves at the expense of Syria as something, this is like a talking point, that they were there to kind of exploit Syrian resources. Syria had very little resources, and kind of, Syria was not Iraq that had kind of lots of oil that can be kind of controlled to the benefit of international powers. Since they were there, they sought to recoup some of their losses through kind of economic contracts. And, the whole way that the regime operates is transactional in terms of rewarding its allies and rewarding its kind of own, military forces, at least the most loyalist forces, in terms of kind of predatory economic transactions. And this is one of the reasons why many people in Aleppo were happy to see the regime melt away, because their presence there had become completely predatory. But, to go to your question, the Russian and kind of Iranian economic contracts and the kind of political economy was really instrumental in various ways, but the main reason was not there for a kind of economic extractivism, because Iran also supplied Syria with significant amounts of oil. So the economic burden on Russia and Iran of the Syrian government was a lot more than that they were benefiting, let's put it that way, in the kind of accounting analysis. They were not there to extract Syrian wealth. They were there to prop up an ally of theirs, essentially.
Ahmad, just before, we're going to come back to this question of strategic relationships, or relationships with alliances and so forth. But just on the question, one of the big economic and social factors in Syria has been the question of refugees, both the refugees internally displaced, and then millions of people pushed either into Turkey or into Europe or into Lebanon or wherever, right? And so what is the impact of, first of all, the displacement of people inside Syria, economically speaking? And then the loss, has there been like a measurable loss of skill in terms of anticipating reconstruction now? Does the absence of all these millions of people, will that hurt the Syrian economy in the future? I mean, what's your sense of the role of refugees in this larger economic question?
Yeah, this is another hugely complicated area that needs to be thought through. So the scale of displacement was immense. So estimates are 50% of the pre-2011 population are no longer in the homes they were in 2011, kind of not voluntarily, but because of the war. Some of them were directly displaced because of armed conflict in the areas where they live. Some of them were more anticipatory. Some of them left because the kind of level of human development and the economy was in vast decline, that they basically had the chance to go to Europe, and they took that chance. So there are a number of reasons, but essentially all of it was due to the fact that there was a war there. And there, as you know very well, from in Lebanon and Turkey and Europe, significant numbers of refugees. So there's the kind of question about refugee return, and could it happen, and how could it happen? And I think it's incredibly complicated because, first of all, as we've been discussing, Syria's economy and state capacity is very low at this point. So it's not capable of actually absorbing millions of people suddenly kind of returning, just at the very basic level of in terms of livelihood availability and basically people's ability to sustain themselves when they return. There's a lot of destruction of residential areas and housing areas around Damascus, throughout the country as well. So basically, people might return and have that, see that their properties are no longer there. They've been destroyed. They're not inhabitable. There's also a large number of, what are grouped by international organizations as HLP, housing, land, and property disputes. There are a lot of people who moved into other people's homes, who are squatting, who are, now taking over land and have been living in it for several years. Sorting out the different kind of logistical and judicial questions about these is incredibly complicated. But then there's also the fact that the security situation is still fluid in the country. So Syrian refugees come from all kind of political convictions, sectarian, ethnic, and other backgrounds. They're not necessarily all one mode of thought, and they don't all have the same level of comfort about returning to Syria. So maybe some refugees who see that HTS is in power basically may be worried that they're going to impose a draconian extremist version of Islam on them that is going to be curtailing their kind of liberties, and they may not want to return. There's the fluid security situation in the country that is uncertain, at least for the time being. So also there's the fact that, many people may not want to return now. But I think the bigger question is going to be how the political transition is going to happen. And this is something, we haven't touched on this yet. I know we're going to touch on it, but basically, how stable is this current government? What are the conditions that are going to be imposed on it in the next period? Who are going to be the main actors? What is the balance of power going to be? Right? What are the fault lines of conflict and how they're going to continue? Whether it's Kurdish, Turkish, Arab, whether it's further Israeli destruction and bombardment. And all other factors, which I know we want to get into, but all of that is going to determine how stable the country is. But I think there is a moment of goodwill among all Syrians, at least so far, in that they want to give this a chance and want to minimize foreign interference. That's the thing I've been hearing, for whomever it is, whether it's actually people who are former loyalists or people who are former opposition. We need to give Syria a chance, given how devastated it is, to actually determine its own path and minimize foreign interference into this process. And I think that's something we should all advocate for, even beyond the narrow whether one supports the current government or not, because I've said this several times before, there's going to be a decade or more long process of rebuilding the country. And in order to rebuild a strong developmental state, we need to assert the Syrian sovereignty, which has been lost. And so, I remember in 2012 when the Muslim Brotherhood came to power, I forget when the elections were, I didn't agree with the Muslim Brotherhood, but they're democratic elections that I felt could lead to a process that could continue, something to be built on. We have to sort of take into account not, just the current moment, but where Syria is heading. And I think there's going to be a lot of efforts to essentially fragment Syria further, to basically deal with different people. And we're seeing some of those very alarming, that the heads of Christian communities are saying, as a Christian community, we need rights. As different sectarian communities, we need rights. As Kurds, we need kind of de facto decentralization. And there may be very good cause to do some administrative decentralization, but rebuilding Syria according to a sectarian allocation of power and sectarian constitution, and seeing Syria as simply a collection of tribes that need to be managed and to get along, is a recipe for permanent conflict, basically. It's a recipe for a permanently weak developmental state that will never be able to meet the needs of its people, let alone recipe for corruption and so on and so forth. And we've obviously don't need to tell you about kind of the Lebanese model of kind of, post-Civil War accord. And I think that's what many people want, not because this is what Syrians necessarily want, but this is the kind of way in which maybe the Emirates and the United States and all sorts of countries will see their interests being kind of manifested in the future of Syria. All right, that was much more than what you asked about refugees, but I think it's all related.
Well, Omar, thank you for that. I mean, that's very clarifying. And of course, the aspirations that Syrians should have a role in building their own sovereign future is absolutely not a role. Should actually have a free sovereign future is utterly correct. But I mean, so there's two questions. One is if we can go back to HTS and explain to our viewers and listeners a little bit about the genealogy of HTS. So is HTS Daesh? Is it Jabhat al-Nusra? And what about, where does that lead to today in terms of the current leadership of HTS? And how does one evaluate that? That's one question, and that's a pretty big question. The other question is just, I'm not sure how, and I hope you'll tackle this later, how you can tackle optimism given the fact that 3 foreign countries have already taken huge chunks of Syria. You have the Israelis, you have the Turks, you have the Americans, you have the Kurds in the north. How is that going to be? How do we even talk about sovereignty? It's like almost like a pipe dream, it seems like. But let's first deal with HTS and then move to sovereignty questions, if you don't mind.
Yeah, of course. So HTS is not Daesh. Its genealogy comes from Al-Qaeda and Jabhat al-Nusra, as I mentioned before. The Jabhat al-Nusra came from Iraq, kind of the most proximate genealogy. So basically, both of al-Nusra and HTS trace their more kind of recent origin to the Syrian conflict. HTS and Al-Qaeda and all sorts of other organizations were formed with basically, from the perspective of the Syrian government, they were all extremist terrorist organizations, but which carried maybe doctrinal differences among them. And I think that this is the main way in which ISIS and al-Nusra distinguish itself, is that al-Nusra and then Hayat Tahrir Sham define themselves within a Syrian liberation framework, a Syrian national liberation framework, whereas ISIS and Daesh saw itself from an Islamic internationalist kind of framework that didn't recognize Syria at all as an entity, basically. And I think Hayat Tahrir Sham has been trying over the past several years. So Hayat Tahrir Sham broke away from al-Nusra. And then if you remember, the way the trajectory of the Syrian war happened was that after the Russian intervention, which helped along Iranian and Hezbollah and Syrian government kind of mobilization, kind of crushing the opposition in various parts of the country, there were all sorts of agreements which allowed many of those fighters to essentially surrender and then leave, and they were all leaving to Idlib. So Idlib province became the place where all sorts of groups that had fought the Syrian regime in that early phase were regrouped, and they started consolidating each other. So Daesh was attacked in 2014, and between 2014 and 2016, most of the groups that were elsewhere in the country were moved to Idlib, and then in 2016 and 2017. Hayat Tahrir Sham absorbed and defeated all those other groups. Absorbed is maybe too gentle a way to describe it, but there were very nasty fights between them, battles, kidnappings, killings, assassinations. Some of them, some of these groups saw that Hayat Tahrir Sham was emerging as the most powerful one, and they kind of consolidated themselves under their leadership. So it's a long process that people can look into kind of all the details, but essentially they came out as the main group in the Northwest, alongside more directly and kind of backed Turkish groups. So there was also in the northwest of the country, an area that was ruled by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and there was an area that were ruled by like the Syrian National Army and Syrian, what was called the Syrian government, that was directly controlled by Turkey, and you had Turkish institutions and Turkish even currency being dealt. So there was these two levels. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham was indirectly supported by Turkey, and there were tensions in various ways between them. But those were kind of the groups that were there. And Hayat Tahrir al-Sham not only tried to define itself as having a Syrian national framework, let's say, of its politics, but also over the years, especially since 2017, 2018, there was an attempt that they were not going to impose a draconian extremist rule in Idlib. There was an attempt to actually, at some level, even reach out to Kurdish political forces when there were tensions between Turkey and Kurdish political forces, an attempt to, in their kind of worldview, reassure minorities that they would not impose on them a certain way of life. So we saw in Idlib not a particularly striking model of governance, but also not the worst kind of governance in terms of what we would imagine an offshoot of Al-Qaeda imposing. It was not something to be hopeful about, but in a sense, it's also neither the kind of the worst fears of many people kind of looking at it. There's also a way in which this process has not happened spontaneously. I think absolutely there's kind of Western attempt to rehabilitate them and teach them, like, if you want to be taken seriously in terms of national politics and ever think that you're going to gain international recognition, you have to speak a certain way, but you also have to act a certain way. So that's what, of course, a lot of the skepticism about them is at this moment. But that's what Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. And I think since the fall of the Syrian government, there's been a lot of positive signals by them that they're trying to build on Syrian institutions rather than destroy Syrian institutions, build on the heritage of kind of the state and not destroy that entirely. It's a fast-moving situation, and probably everything I say, we can see a contradictory tendency. But I think part of where that optimism comes is that they haven't immediately sought retribution. They haven't immediately basically declared a de facto government forever. The situation is right now is that the current government appointed a caretaker government. This is not appropriate, kind of legally, and even not appropriate even from the perspective of oppositional forces. So they appointed their own caretaker government until March 1st. So the legality of the current government in Syria gave itself until March 1st, but we don't know what's going to happen March 1st. But a lot of Syrian groups that I know that I'm involved with are trying to mobilize to, as much as possible, kind of push for an appropriate process of kind of political transition that is not along the lines that I mentioned, that is exclusionary or that is kind of sectarian or in any other way. So we're going to see what's going to happen in less than 80 days, basically. But I think that's where a lot of people are trying to put their efforts in mobilization right now. So that's in terms of the first question. In terms of the second question, I go back to what I'm saying. It's impossible to expect anything significant at the moment in terms of a kind of the national sovereignty that you'd expect from a country that was devastated, that was already kind of highly penetrated by international actors. I think there has to be a thinking of what are the things that we need to put in place for 5 or 10 years that doesn't lead us down the path of permanent conflict. I think there is the hope or optimism is not because it's just wishful thinking. I think there is a way in which there might be an investment by regional powers not to have a complete collapse of the country, kind of for security reasons. I don't think that's beneficial for Turkey. I don't think that's beneficial for other regional powers necessarily as well, to have just a complete collapse. The one, kind of counter to that is Israel, which you've already seen kind of an attempt that, Syria needs to be fragmented. There needs to be a Druze state. There needs to be a Kurdish state. There needs to be kind of more kind of statelets there. But this is kind of the kind of Israeli fantasies, which we've seen them coincide along with this kind of aggression that has happened over the past few weeks. But the big axis, I would say, in terms of direct control of politics is going to be Turkey Qatar on one hand, and the UAE on the other hand. And the way we're seeing this play out in terms of discussions is around United Resolution 2254. So United Nations Resolution 2254 was the prevailing United Nations resolution that's basically kind of tried to dictate the transition. This was passed in 2015, I believe. Um, the way the politics is playing out right now in Syria is those who don't want to see international interference into the country are saying 2254 is no longer valid because it assumed there was a Syrian government as an interlocutor. Whereas in the meeting that took place in Jordan that involved Emirates and Saudi Arabia and others, they basically said, no, 2254 is still valid because it provides an opportunity to kind of internationalize and continue the internationalization of the Syrian conflict. So I'm not saying one is right or one is wrong in terms of what's best for Syria, but I think if you're looking from a perspective of actually reducing the internationalization in the negative sense of every power trying to appoint its representative in the country, I would say that having a Syrian-led process is the way to go. But these are some of the fault lines. So to go back to your point, Osama, it can be thought of potentially as a pipe dream given the reality on the ground. But I think the question is not whether it's a pipe dream. The question is, what are the different realistic scenarios that we have right now for the future of Syria? What is the most positive scenario, and how can we advocate? I'm talking about conversation among Syrians, not necessarily conversations among outside of Syrians, but as Syrians are saying, what are the different scenarios? Realistically, right now, what can we do given the balance of power, given the level of state capacity, economic needs, fault lines of conflict, the war economy, and so on? If you take those structural factors, what is the most realistic scenario, second best, third best, and how can we make the best scenario most plausible and most realistic? What are the things we want to advocate for? And these are what a lot of us actually, and I've reached out to lots of former colleagues to organize our thoughts, like what can we do right now to actually improve this? So analytically, I'm at a space where I'm analytically pessimistic. What is the phrase, right? Pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. That's the moment we're at right now.
Ahmad, just wanted to ask, we're going to come back to the present and the future in a second, but just to ask a quick follow-up on the difference between Daesh and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. The Sham in Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, Sham, for those of us, our audience who don't speak Arabic, literally means sort of Damascus, but it means Syria. And then does it mean Syria, the nation state as we understand it now, or does it mean Greater Syria, meaning the Levant? So is there a reference to that Greater Syria project in the name of HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or is it, as you're saying, the small Syria, the national scale of Syria, the localized scale of Syria?
As far as I know, it's Syria within its national borders. And I'm not an expert on the doctrinal differences and the nuances among let's say when they, in terms of their broader view about what's going to happen in terms of the region. But as far as I know, they've tried and they've insisted that their framework is the smaller Sham, like Syria as Sham, rather than Bilad al-Sham, essentially.
Ahmad, so you were mentioning sort of the intra-Syrian discussion that you are kind of part of, and that you've been part of for quite a while. You mentioned your work at ESQA and the kind of the talking about the reconstruction work that was supposed to have taken place, many years ago. Can you give us an idea of what people expect in this kind of state building project? Is this an idea that there's an assumption that there is sovereignty? I mean, does it begin with that? Does there need to be total sovereignty? Do the Israelis need to leave? If you want to forget about the Golan Heights for now, at least all the territory that they've occupied since, over the past week or two, that the Turks have to withdraw from Syria. Is there an assumption that has to happen? Or is the assumption we need to get the kind of local economy going, we need to get sanctions taken off, and therefore the conditionalities, the US, I think already, Blinken, I think, came out and already stated his 3-4 conditions, which I think includes basically agreeing with Israelis whatever they want, more or less. Um, so this question of how do you build this economy? How do you build what I think you and me and many of us hope to be a non-sectarian kind of Syria moving forward, in light of all these conditions and in light of the fact that sanctions won't be lifted unless sovereignty is not respected, at least as far as the Israelis are concerned, and probably as far as the Turks are concerned, at least for the short to medium term, as far as I know. So what is the thought? What is what are the assumptions even before we even get to the economic model? And how do you build the health, the infrastructure, the health, the education again? How do you accommodate all the refugees that presumably will return sooner or later, hopefully sooner, but eventually over time, over the next year or so, hopefully many of them will be able to return. Is there an assumption?
Well, I don't know if there's an assumption. I mean, I think it's hard for me to say what all Syrians want, obviously, right? I mean, I can tell you from my vantage point what discussions I'm hearing and what kind of people's basic aspirations are. But I think regardless of what, whether or not I know what all Syrians want, I think we can kind of think of what are the basics of a national interest, Syrian national interest at this point. What would those elements be, right? What are the things that should be considered non-negotiable for a Syrian national interest? I'll say that from my perspective, it's territorial integrity of Syria at the very least. Syria should not be divided in any political sense. The fact that Syria's, the Israeli occupation is still an illegal occupation, and the further aggression is an act of aggression, and also a destruction of the Syrian army reveals that Syria is an enemy of Israel is an enemy of Syrians and Syria, regardless of the regime that it's in. Basically, that's kind of at the basic level of a national interest. I think we don't know what Syrians want in terms of politics and economics, but we need a process for that to emerge. So the second level of national interest is that no one can come and appoint and dictate what the constitution is going to be, what the form of rule is going to be arbitrarily and unilaterally, without a process that, at least at the very minimal, tries to be inclusive in a way that different Syrians can feel themselves represented, right? So that's a national interest. No one has a national interest in unilateral declarations of what the future of Syria is going to be. Not because it's also a principle, but because it's going to lead to conflict, right? If Hayat Tahrir Sham basically says, this is what's going to happen, and this is the constitution, and there's just a referendum, do you accept it or not? That's not in the national interest. I mean, that's how the Ba'ath Party used to actually behave. So that's also in the national interest. The other part of this is then foreign intervention, and I think there are ways in which this is something more complicated. So in my opinion, Turkish presence in Syria is not interested in political divisions of Syria, not necessarily because it has the best interests of Syrians, but because it sees the establishment of an autonomous Kurdish region as a threat to its national security, right? And I think as a national interest for Syria, there has to be a compromise in which there is recognition of Kurdish political, civil, and even cultural rights and significant administrative decentralization, not along sectarian lines, but along kind of provincial lines, that would actually allow people to kind of have some sort of kind of local stake in the economy, but not a political decentralization. And I don't think Turkey, as a very influential foreign actor, is interested in political decentralization. Here I'm kind of moving towards, kind of the other part of your question of what, international forces will kind of allow. And I think, on the other hand, there are other powers like the UAE that see what's happened as a net gain for the Turkish-Qatari axis and are going to try tooth and nail to prevent that, right? And I think that's a concern here. But in terms of going back to the national interest and where people want to go, territorial sovereignty, kind of an inclusive political process, lifting the sanctions, I think, is in the national interest at this point. Lifting the broad-based sanctions. I mean, I think, this idea that there's kind of going to be conditionality if this is what the European Union spokesman, if they respect, women's rights and so on. This is essentially an external imposition on Syria that is unacceptable to me. As someone who is interested in a progressive, state that guarantees rights of everyone and is respectful of all sorts of political and civil rights, it's unacceptable that the EU says we're going to strangle the economy unless we see AB3, or else we're going to kind of suffocate you to death. And I think it's idiotic also, because it's going to, create more conflict basically in the country. So I think those are the kind of elements that we need to move forward. They're very difficult, and I think, we could be sitting here within a month or 2 months and see a major conflict relapse. There's also other dynamics that are not even related to the big geopolitical axes, which is that most of the focus now is happening in the cities, and there's a neglect in what's happening in the countryside. And there's some reports that former regime soldiers are going back and carrying out their frustrations in some areas in the country, and there's extrajudicial assassinations. There's a severe lack of security, for lack of a better word, in many areas in the countryside. So it's very, very fragile, not just because of all the things about it, but all sorts of other things that actually dynamics that are happening, that unless there's an economic revival instantly and a massive kind of way in which Syria can actually, rebuild the country, that's, the next few months are going to be very, very dangerous.
Just a final question on the question of the Constitution. Can you just update us? I mean, I know Geir Pedersen and the UN have been working on this constitutional reforms for what seems to be quite a few years, and that involved supposedly opposition, but also governmental and opposition, or at least selected opposition, which HTS is not, because it's on the terrorist list. So what is that? Is that process over? Is the UN role, at least that role, over in terms of what it means to be a Syrian-led constitutional process? Is that the forum where that and it sort of changes shape? Different people can come in, different actors come in, and other actors are taken out? Or are you talking about a different process altogether that just begins now in Damascus through the forces that are on the ground with whatever forces are brought in? Just a clarification, because there is that this kind of external UN Security Council, UN agreed upon, Russian agreed upon. I mean, this is the main process that's been taking place over the past quite a few years now.
Geir Pedersen has been active on that, but it's not a fully UN process, because if you remember, there was the Astana process, which generated a list of joint government opposition activities to kind of be building towards a political reconciliation process, right? Of which all of it was rejected by the Syrian government. And here I go back to that comment that, after really the government had won.
Right, Ahmad, Astana, we're talking Turkey, Russia, and Iran, right?
Correct. So from, the United Nations was working on what the de facto powers would allow, right? The United Nations is not an independent organization that can do whatever it wants. It's basically dictated by what the powers who control the United Nations or control the Security Council or the de facto powers on the ground would allow. And what the de facto powers on the ground would allow was this kind of constitutional reform process, which was endless and preposterous, really. I mean, that's the only way to basically, it went nowhere for many years. And the Syrian government would always reject. It's not totally on the Syrian government, but essentially they had the kind of the upper hand in this. And they continued kind of postponing it on and on and on. The problem with that process is that the main actors have, on the one hand, the Syrian regime had collapsed, so it's no longer an actor as such. So that's half of the equation is gone. And among the opposition, it was led by the e'tilaf, which has also lost legitimacy because it was seen, on the one hand, as too accommodating to the regime, as too ineffectual, and they're not the ones who did the liberation. So the kind of from the opposition side, there's a loss of legitimacy to the two main actors who were essentially key involved in that process. And so it's unlikely that they're going to pick up the pieces immediately. I mean, Geir Pedersen is trying to kind of reinsert himself, and there's a lot of, no doubt there's significant kind of legal experience that was generated, but I doubt that it's going to be essentially we're going to pick up the pieces of that. And that's tied to what I said earlier, that the whole UN 2254, which provides even the groundwork from which the Astana process and then the constitutional process also referred to, is under question right now. So it's really not clear. The answer to your question is not clear. If you're asking me kind of my instinct or my hunch, given where the political center of gravity is, it's unlikely, but that depends on, I would say, the negotiations that are taking place right now. US, Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar. I mean, Israel, no doubt, but at least directly.
Ahmad, actually, on that question specifically, while we're having this discussion about possible constitutional arrangements or what the future could look like and so on, as we know, the Israelis are not just in occupation of the Golan, they've expanded their occupation of southern Syria, and their tanks are, as I understand it, about 20 kilometers from Damascus. And they've been, for the past 2 weeks, extensively bombing installations throughout Syria, such that the Air Force and helicopters and whatever would have been the basis for the material protection of Syrian sovereignty is being destroyed, if it's not already totally destroyed. So clearly they have their interests in this, in what's going on too. And if we know anything from the Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon, they won't just go away because they're asked to go away or because international law says they should go away. So since also, among other things here, lurking in the background of this conversation is what some people call the axis of resistance. The fall of the Syrian government is seen by some people as that was like the linchpin in some ways of the axis of resistance, in that it was the geographical connection between Lebanon and Iran, for one thing. So the question is, given what looks like a more permanent Israeli occupation of southern Syria, given the destruction, the Israel's systematic destruction of military facilities and installations and infrastructure and so forth, what does it mean to talk? I mean, some people, a cynic might say, what does it mean to talk about the contours of Syrian sovereignty given a much more permanent Israeli occupation? And then where's the resistance going to come from to oppose the Israeli occupation of Syria, not to mention other occupied Arab territories?
Well, I mean, I think there are different ways to think about that. And, Syria was occupied by Israel and has been occupied for several decades. So the fact that Damascus was not occupied, but the Golan is occupied, doesn't, to me, as a Syrian, mean that Syria was free from Israeli occupation. What Israel has done is further move into what was called the demilitarized buffer zone that was established after the ceasefire agreement and a later agreement in 1974, and created something called UNDOF, which I'm not remembering what all, United Nations Disengagement something force. I forget what the O stands for. Observation, maybe.
Probably observation, knowing the UN.
Observation force. The Karim would know, maybe would know better. But basically, this is something that, you're right, the Syrian government was the kind of glue in many ways. Glue not in the sense that they're the leading vanguard of the resistance axis, but geographically, they're what provided the geographic depth, they provided the strategic depth, they provided the ability for the resistance axis to be an axis and not just scattered kind of agreements. But I think, but I would point to the fact that, in terms of Syrian sovereignty and the occupation of the Golan, that was basically something that was happening for decades. This is not to say that, there's this kind of, idea that the Syrian regime was not a true resistance and so on, right? This is not the kind of discussion I'm having. But the thing is, one of the, to me, really infuriating things about what happened is that the Syrian regime has been stockpiling weapons for decades. Russian tanks, thousands of Russian tanks, Russian fighters, Scud missiles that allegedly had kind of chemical and biological weapons, all these kind of missile defense systems, and they collapsed without firing a single shot at Israel. that's a reality we also have to understand. Like, until when was the regime thinking they're going to recapture the Golan Heights, right? Until when are they actually thinking they're actually going to support the resistance axis, that was being decimated? While the resistance axis was being decimated, the Syrian government was looking for a way out by United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. And in 2013, they gave up their chemical weapons to stay in power, right? I mean, the chemical weapons were not weapons that we ever hoped would be used necessarily. If used at all, it would be potentially in a war to deter Israel or in a war with Israel, or alternatively, to be dismantled in return for a major concession by Israel for Palestinians or for kind of even over Syrian sovereignty, let alone to be, kind of dismantled in the way just to preserve the Assad regime in power. I mean, we have to look at this trajectory, like I said.
Sorry, I didn't interrupt, but the question of the chemical weapons is interesting. The reason you had this massive international disarmament campaign in Syria at the time, if you remember 2013, this period where there was a massive humanitarian crisis, the refugee crisis, the political sort of the negotiations weren't going very far, and yet the entire world mobilized to get these chemical weapons out, and it was an extremely incredibly quick process that involved, over I think 40 countries that were involved, and a huge amount of money that was, given quite freely, and that was precisely to allow the only deterrence that Syria had against the Israelis, which were the chemical weapons, to be removed. So this had nothing to do with the fact of, from the American point of view and from the international point of view, it had very little to do with who used the chemical weapons and the humanitarian tragedy that is ensued in that, but much more to remove a potential deterrence to the Israelis, which is why when the Americans wanted to focus on something, they were able to get that done, and done very, very strongly. So yes, of course, the Assad regime understood that they could preserve themselves, and that the Russians and the Americans came up with this deal. But I think it's important to kind of to bear that in mind, that now they're dismantling the strategic military infrastructure, all that remains that the new government could use, that might potentially have been, if not a deterrence, at least some kind of defense against the Israelis. That's all being obliterated. And so I think to follow what Sadi was saying, the question is, there doesn't seem to be much pushback on that from this new government or the new.
I think that's a very important point, Karim. And I think actually I don't know if you have any direct evidence, but I'm sure evidence will come out that in 2013, this is what Israel wanted. Rather than actually an all-out armed attack, that let's just defang the final kind of capacity of the regime to actually kind of resist Israel. But at this point, what can we expect from the new government? I mean, again, going back to what is a national interest, what is something that we can actually plausibly think about, is condemnation of what Israel is doing. At the very minimum, is basically an assertion that this, the Golan is Syrian land, is, at the very minimum, basically an assertion that, this is not acceptable for Syrians, that this is basically an asset for the Syrian people, in the same way that they're saying for other Syrian institutions, right? I mean, I think what they have tried to say is that we want to preserve the Syrian institutions because these are an asset of the Syrian people, not of the Syrian regime. Well, similarly, the military assets are an asset of the Syrian people. And I think that's I think the minimum we can expect. That's not something we're seeing. And of course, that's troubling. I think there's a moment now when also all of the political powers really feel that in this moment of Israeli, US-backed Israeli impunity, any power that might actually even, say that they're going to be refusing Israeli dictates might be annihilated. I mean, I think there's a very real chance that Golani, for example, if he really comes out and says, actually, I'm going to continue a project of resistance and kind of, take back Israeli, Syrian land, what's going to happen to Golani? I mean, I think it's even beyond the realm of possibility that he'd say something like this. That doesn't mean this is an excuse for the Syrian government to actually take a stand on national sovereignty, right? And that's something that, many of the Syrians who I would say supported the opposition would expect them. But there are also many Syrians, as we know, who are not already saying that opposition groups in particular that we need to make peace with Israel, and we need to kind of the whole region is normalizing. So there are normalizers among the Syrian opposition as well, and it's going to be a battle. But of course, it's the reality is as you see it in front of you.
So if I could just ask a follow up on this question, how extensive are what you're calling the normalizers in Syria? I mean, do they represent? I guess it's a question to be determined. Do they represent a large, significant chunk of people in Syria? Is it a reaction to the fact that the previous regime had so consistently manipulated and abused the language of Palestine to promote itself? Can you explain a little bit more about this? Just before.
Also, just as an addition to Osama's question, Ahmad, I think I could be wrong, but I think Jolani said that his interest or Syria's interest is neutrality and the question of Palestine, which is, of course, very disturbing from our perspective.
That's a discussion in Lebanon, and that's a follow-up from the discussion in Lebanon. But the question of neutrality, meaning, we na'ib al-nafs as well, this business of, where we are not related to this question of Palestine. We're not, we're not going to normalize as such. We're just going to.
But he did say it, right? He did say it, I think, didn't he?
Yeah, I think he did.
Yeah, and but they also, supposedly filed a complaint with the United Nations against the Israeli attacks. Not to say that that represents much, but I mean, I'm going back to kind of thinking about just thinking through this process. Like, what is it possible for any government to do right now, right? Realistically possible. Just to go back to Osama's question, I think we can see how governments can impose normalization even if the majority of Syrians are against normalization, right? I mean, I think part of what we want, which I think Israel is the enemy of, is a truly democratic state to emerge in Syria that actually represents the will of its people. And I think that's something that Israel is not going to allow or try to undermine as much as possible. I would say a significant sector of the US-based official Syrian opposition, who, as many people know, if you want to be taken seriously in DC and rise in the ranks and kind of be, invited back to meetings, you have to speak the language of normalization, speak the language of this is, Iran is really the one that's kind of the force that's controlling Syria and so on. So I would say, this is true in a large part of the official kind of opposition. The overwhelming majority of Syrians I know reject this. The overwhelming majority of Syrians can't accept Israeli occupation, and not just occupation. I mean, what we are seeing right now is an outright humiliation of Syrians and a mockery of Syrians. It's basically saying, we can bomb you at will. There's nothing you can do about it. And no one's going to stop us, and no one's going to hold us accountable. So, and again, this is an outcome of a US empowered Israel. And now with Trump coming to power, we can expect maybe something similar or more. I'm not sure. This is kind of speculative at this point. But again, this is an outcome of that. I mean, this is not necessarily that, whatever government is in power in Syria is going to have very limited capacity to do this. If the forces that were preparing to fight Israel for years and years and years kind of were degraded by, kind of this US-backed Israeli attacks, a country that is incredibly weak is not going to be able to do it.
So Omar, we're going to wrap soon. Karim will wrap soon, but just one final question to take us back to the very beginning of what you said at the beginning of this interview or discussion with you. You said you grew up in an Arab nationalist household, right? You said, if I remember correctly, you said a Nasserist household as opposed to a Ba'athist household. But in general, the idea of a secular Arab nationalist position, correct, and outlook and humanism in a sense, ecumenical, secular, so on and so forth. What of that do you think? I know this is a big question, but it's like sort of a philosophical question. What of that still remains, not just for you, but how do you view it in this new world that we're living in? As you think about your past and where we're going in the future, how much do you think of what you learned still applies and what you grew up with still applies today in Syria and in the wider region?
I think at a practical level, it calls for us to, at the very minimum, initiate a project of thinking carefully about the interconnectedness of the Lebanese, Palestinians, Syrians, or Jordanians at a minimum, if not the wider region. I mean, we've all seen how, with the uprisings that happened in Tunisia and Egypt, how there was a co-inspiration between different, kind of parts of what we used to call the Arab region, or what I still call the Arab region, right? And I work with kind of organizations in basically even Beirut, such as the Arab Council for the Social Sciences, that define themselves in the kind of Arab regional framework. That space still there, I think. Not necessarily in the center of gravity is no longer there. The center of gravity is for, I would say, if it exists almost in a sense of elite, state-led Gulf Arab nationalist discourse that has, instrumentalizes the language of Arabism for purposes that I think are their own narrow interest, not just of their states, but of their ruling elites, in my opinion, and as a way to sort of say that Iran is not Arab and therefore should be kind of confronted, rather than a political project of national liberation and emancipation. But I think at the very least in the areas of, going back to Bilad al-Sham, as Sari mentioned, we need to think about a collective future. I mean, it's impossible to think anymore, I think, of a siloed state by state future that isolates all these people together. I'm not talking about this in terms of wishful thinking. I'm talking about a practical, actual project of human development, national liberation, essentially a way of actually thinking about collective futures together, because we know that they are connected materially and objectively. And I think that's something, to me, that's going to be an important part of the new era. There's a new era right now. I mean, even the vocabulary that we had, the Syrian regime was the last remnant of a vocabulary of post-colonial type of state, that maybe it was the last one. I mean, Egypt was an inheritor of that, but to what extent that even remains in Egypt, I don't know. Actually, it'd be interesting to see, because Egypt also sees itself as being set back by what's happened in Syria. I mean, there's at least at the official level, not at the popular level, but at the official level, they're seeing itself set back. But I think, at least in the Bilad al-Sham, as we traditionally defined it, I think I see it as a practical project that we should pursue in the region. And I think in Lebanon right now, there are probably similar conversations happening of how do we think about this new reality. And this is a chance to kind of really actually meaningfully connect over those shared futures.
Omar, thank you. I think that's a wonderful way to end, in a sense, in this moment of hope, despite this incredibly, what at least I find to be a very kind of depressing period. I think it's a very nice way to kind of think to remember that we are fighting a project. Sama talks about economical, this kind of coexistence project, and being able to understand that these states are broken apart, but the possibilities to try to reconnect at least Bilad al-Sham and Mashriq areas, at least that level, is a worthwhile, and as you said, not just a pie in the sky kind of thing, but a practical thing that we need to kind of work towards. I think that's really important. And to Salman Ansari, to connect to all our other previous podcasts, I think this project is almost by definition in opposition to the Zionist project. And this is part of our problem, this American-backed Zionist project, which does not allow the Mashriq to be what it needs to be, which is this kind of coexistence, this economical world, this thing where there's no borders, back and forth, communities work together, common language, common history, etc. So it's something for us to kind of think about. Ahmad, thank you so much for being part of this conversation and for your, it's been a long session, but we've benefited tremendously from this, and for all your thoughtful work and for your work moving forward. I think it's going to be very important.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much. Bye.
Okay, guys, I think we just had a really kind of thought-provoking discussion with Omar and I'm glad it ended in this kind of in a hopeful way, at least looking forward, at least into the medium and perhaps the long term. What did you guys think?
And I mean, there is obviously, with the end of a dismal, tyrannical, torturous regime, there's always going to be hope. But the problem is now it has always been in the question of Syria. The circumstances in which the demise of the regime is brought about are, some of the most baleful actors on the planet are interceding now and have always been there. I mean, that's part of the point too. They've always, the Israelis and the Turks and the UAE and the Saudis and the Iranians and whoever, they're all pulling strings and they're all involved. And so now Syria is trying to find, or the idea that Syria is going to try to find its sovereignty and national stability and so forth under these circumstances. I don't know. I mean, I'd like to think, I mean, I admire his hope, and I'm always hopeful about things in general. That's my stock in trade is almost futile optimism, but I don't know. There's a lot to be hopeful for, but there's also a hell of a lot to be worried about. And above all, for me, of course, it's the Israeli, not just the expanding Israeli occupation of southern Syria, but as I said, as we talked about with Omar, the destruction of any possibility of rebuilding Syrian sovereignty. That is clearly not what Tel Aviv wants, and therefore, I don't know. How could you have sovereignty without resistance? This is like what we've been talking about all along: resistance or sovereignty. And it's almost as though the price of Syrian sovereignty is a lack of sovereignty. I mean, it's paradoxical and self-contradictory. I don't know, Osama, what did you think?
Exactly that. I mean, that we're living in this kind of Orwellian world on the one hand, and it depends on location. On the one hand, we can all understand, and we agree with Omar, what he said at the beginning, which is that, of course, one should be happy and have hope and seeing people freed from prisons and the end of a police state, etc. These are all causes of joy and happiness for anybody who's suffered under this regime. On the other hand, as from the very beginning, there's always been a geopolitical context. And there's the fact that the Israelis, and Omar said this, the Israelis humiliated Syria and Syrians after the fall of the police state and took advantage of that, not only to expand its occupation of Syria, but also destroyed and devastated the very basis of any form of sovereignty, which is having the military capacity to hold together a country. And with that gone, I just don't understand how we can pretend, or how anyone can pretend, that the future is not filled with all sorts of extraordinary impediments. But, let's see. None of us are soothsayers. None of us are prophets. We'll see what happens.
I think we all agree on this basic point. And I think what Omar kind of brought is his expertise, in a sense, on this kind of state building, peace building, reconstruction, the discussions of sanctions, etc. And what I was trying to say towards the end was that, yes, we have this paradox. You mentioned this paradox between its sovereignty, but the price of getting a kind of sovereignty is to lose sovereignty, at least to the Israelis, if not to the Turks, certainly to the Israelis, and that's going to be part of the conditions. In fact, I think it's more or less been stated by Blinken.
A simulacrum of sovereignty is really what we have.
But this is what's on offer in Lebanon. What's on offer in Lebanon is,
and Palestine and the PA.
Okay, but Palestine is a slightly different thing, because it wasn't even a state in a sense. Here we're talking about the Lebanese state is that had that for what it's worth anyway. It's a state, at least formally, legally, etc. And what's being offered now, as was the case 2006 and before 2006, was to say you're allowed to build your state. You can focus on economic plans and things like within reason, of course. You can operate certain things, but you have to allow an Israeli occupation or hegemony or demilitarized zone or something, whatever it is at the moment that they decide they want to do. That has to happen in order for you to be able to have your economic, to be left at least not have sanctions on you, if not encouraged, if not help, at least not have mass sanctions put on you. And this is what's on the table today. Lebanon is being told, okay, either you set up an army which in reality needs, from the American point of view, to be in opposition to Hezbollah. I mean, that's the deal at hand. And that's therefore an expression of sovereignty, which is to the exclusion of a major political party and social force that's in Lebanon. So it's this kind of paradox where one side is saying sovereignty, which by definition means the absence of Hezbollah, and the other one is saying sovereignty means the requirement of Hezbollah and the requirement of resistance as long as there's an Israel. And so the very notion of sovereignty is what's contested. And we're seeing this same thing is going to take place, I think, in Syria. But what I'm saying, though, what the American side allows for is money, is a lifting of sanctions, It's the idea of saying, okay, you can, and that they did at one point I mean, basically it's the Ramallah model versus the Gaza model. Either you're under siege and sanctioned, and this is even pre-genocide, but sort of the siege, the sanctions, the kind of limited in so many ways and surrounded, or you are occupied, etc. But there's a kind of, the bankers are allowed to open banks. You can bring in money from outside. You can kind of more or less go to Jordan if you want to. They can harass you, but sort of it's kind of open, and that's the model that's at hand. And that's what, as long as there's Israel in the region, that's the model that Lebanon, Syria, and the other, forget even Palestine. These are that the measure that we're talking about towards the end with Oman. This is what's on, and the same thing's going to happen to Egypt.
But what's
Egypt
interesting?
is not so far off.
What's interesting about that is that it goes back to one of Netanyahu's plans for Palestine, going back, I think, to the 90s. This thing of economic, they can be economically free, but they're going to have no vestige of sovereignty. We will control everything: their airspace, their borders, the water,
and that's what he's doing.
But my point is, what's interesting is that he was proposing that. Of course, he's gotten much worse since then, but this is like the high point of Netanyahu. He was proposing that for a militarily occupied territory. Basically, what he wants in Syria and Lebanon are the same circumstances imposed on territories, that he doesn't militarily control. He wants to have his cake and eat it too. It's kind of, and of course, insofar as he gets anything, as the Israelis get anything, it's because of what I would consider their main asset, which is the U.S. saying, "Oh yeah, you could do this," and and that's.
Oh, of course. No, I think that's without a doubt.
But I think the question we should have asked Omar now in retrospect is to go back to Syria to figure it. I mean, I agree with you what you're saying, Sadi, and I agree, Karim, what you're both saying. But in a sense, when you think back, when we don't know, obviously we don't know what's going to happen in the near future, other than clearly that the Israeli occupation will continue. The Turkish invasion, or the Turkish incursion into Syria, invasion of Syrian sort of lands, is also continuing. The American invasion of Syria, whatever, they're all, these armies are there planted. So it's obvious that there's no sovereignty in any meaningful way for the foreseeable future. In fact, for decades into the future. But the question is, when we look historically, as a historian, you look back at this period and you say, okay, so what of this period in post-colonial Syria? I think you mentioned post-colonial Syria. So after the French created Syria, Ahmad created post-colonial Syria. So after let's just say 40, the mid 1940s, 1946, all the way until today, in a sense. What is it that was salvageable from that project? Pre-Ba'ath, Ba'ath, post-Ba'ath. What is salvageable from that project in terms of the ideas of do you see what I'm saying? The education, what is salvageable from that project? Or was it all a pipe dream? Was it all a catastrophe? Was it all negative? And these are the questions that Syrians are going to have to grapple with ultimately, because you can't really have, I mean, the idea is the French came in and created a partitioned Syria into Druze, Alawi, and Sunni regions. And here we have today in 2024, the situation in Syria is vastly, actually it's vastly, it's I don't know how one looks at it, other than saying that the prisons, thank God, have been broken, and let's hope they're not filled again soon.
Yeah, I think the final question, and Osama, maybe you can talk about this a little bit, is this question of the sectarian question. I mean, I remember Lakhdar Brahimi in 2014 when he was coming in as the UN envoy. He said, that's it, I can't do it anymore, because Syria basically, even then, was a civil war, a proxy war, and a sectarian war. And so the question of, I mean, it's interesting that Jolani now is coming in and saying, okay, we're all together, we're all Syrians, we respect the Christians, etc. He seems to be, he's messaging anyway something positive, which is better than the reverse of that, obviously. The question is whether now, when they start to do the work of the constitutional work, when they start to do the public laws and decrees that are going to come out of the government, and education, let's see what they start to when they start redoing education and books and things like this, whether they will be able to have a constitution which does respect, not as Omar was saying. Yeah.
But the Constitution, Karim, the Constitution itself is like, it's just a scrap of paper, in a sense of, In other words, in a place like Syria or Lebanon or Palestine or any of these places, or Iraq, it depends on sovereignty.
We're
Are
talking
you
about the
going to have
national
actual
project.
sovereignty to be
No,
able
these are
to
two different things. I think the
enforce
national
whatever
project,
constitutional
sovereignty is the
reform you
formality.
come up
It's the formality. It's what your territory is recognized as, and your foreign relations, etc. The national project, is it one that's based on a kind of, we're all equal citizens, or is it something which is federalized, not administratively, as Omar was saying, because that's possible, that could work at a certain level, but to be divided sectarian, as you're saying, to go back to the fantasy saying, okay, here's the Alawite, even within a Syria, even if you don't divide it formally, okay, sort of more like Iraq, which is not divided formally, but still, you got the Kurdish part, the Sunni part, the Shia part, and that's how it was done. So here you can have the Kurdish part, the Alawite part, the Christian enclaves or kind of Christian protected zones where you're allowed to have alcohol.
That's the Israeli dream, that every little group has its little state.
But it's not just the it's not just the Israeli dream. It precedes the it's a colonial dream. I mean, it's long before the Israelis. It was a French colonial dream, and then it became, it became, and look what the Americans in Iraq in 2003. And what I find astonishing, again, in this moment, is that how nobody talks about Iraq 2003, the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and what happened subsequently in Iraq. It's as if that's completely irrelevant to a discussion of what's happening in Syria, even though you have many of the same actors. And so it's really
because interestingly, just to interrupt, because interestingly, it's because people are worried about the Libyan model now, which is the other thing, that there was a NATO overthrow. So like Iraq is like they're looking at Libya and saying, okay, let's not become like Libya. That's the model people are worried about now.
Anyway, let's hope all the best for Syria, and for Syrians, and for Palestinians and Lebanese and Iraqis and Jordanians and everyone.
Okay, take care, guys.